Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It is 5:08 on November 12th. This is the Planning Commission meeting in council chambers. We are going to start with item A1. Before that, we have a quorum on the dais. We're missing Commissioners Yanis Pulido and Schneider. And everyone else is present. And Shaw. And Commissioner Shaw, thank you. We're going to start with item A1, the code revision. Like we said yesterday, we were able to add new amendments until 9 a.m. this morning. We had agreed to 2 to 3, and I think some commissioners got maybe ahead of themselves and submitted 5, but that's okay. We're only going to take up probably another 2 at the most. 3 total. So we took one round. We started with Azar and came down over here and finished with Commissioner Shea. So we're going to pick up with Commissioner Yanis Pulido and then make our way down and go around in circles until we get probably 3 total, and then we'll see where we are. That's probably as many as we can do is my guess. After that, we're going to do sort of a maybe another 2 minutes per commissioner of just general comments on what we've done. We might do that after we have a motion to pass this along to City Council. So that motion will include the staff draft, all of the amendments that we've done over the last few days, and I'll share those dates with you. Staff's supplemental report that includes the growth concept map amendment and a couple other things, and I'll go over those again, but we'll do that at the end. And with that motion, you'll have a chance to speak for or against, and I'll give every commissioner a chance to speak to that as we move this along to council, as is this body's responsibility. All right, so with that, we'll start with A1. We'll start with Commissioner Anderson, and we're going to go until 6. We'll take a break, and then we'll reconvene to take on our regular time-certain items on our agenda. And we'll have staff read the agenda then. Any questions? Okay, if not, Commissioner Anderson, your favorite amendment?
Chair, Commission Liaison Andrew Rivera, I believe you have speakers.
Speakers, thank you. I have 2 cards, Ron Thrower and Francis Acuna. Mr. Thrower, you'll have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, Commissioners. Ron Thrower. Just wanted to, first of all, thank you all for all the work you're doing to move Austin into a different direction than what's been in place for the last 30-plus years. And also acknowledge the tremendous amount of work that the staff has done over the past several months that they've done. A tremendous amount of dialogue and a tremendous amount of outreach, and certainly a tremendous amount of communication. And it's actually been a pleasure to work with them through this process. But lastly, I just wanted to point out one item that I think is still missing and a little bit critical to this overall discussion, and that's the model. We've only had access to the model for about the last 10 days, and we haven't been able to fully crack it open yet, and we're a little concerned with the unknown at this point. And as with the last model that was brought forward with Draft 3 of the Code Next, we were able to point out some misinformation, inaccuracies in the model that actually lessened the amount of the capacity. And our concern is that we're going to perhaps discover some items in this modeling process as well. I'm hoping that it's very conservative, but I can't imagine that we're going through all this exercise and let's just say that the actual capacity comes down to 350,000 or whatever, somewhere south of the 397 that's in the model today. I'm only bringing that up as a point because y'all are doing great efforts to make Austin a better place today, and we want to have the model be accurate as possible so that it can fulfill all of the policies and goals for Austin. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thrower. Next, we have Francis Acuna. You'll have 1 minute.
Thank you for allowing me to be here. And today I just would like to thank you for all you do and for your time. I also would like to let you know that I've been a member of a contact team since 2012, and that has been the only way that we know what is being developed in our neighborhood. I always hear that the city says the community is the eyes and ears of, the city, of the police, of, anything that goes on within the departments. The community is the voice. They are the ears of all the departments. And I do want to say that, if the contact team goes away, it will be not a very good thing for us. And you'll be given the entitlement right away, and it can take away all public review. This is the only way that we are able to see what we can, allow within the floodplains within our neighborhood, what is going to be impacting our homes and our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now Commissioner Anderson. One more? Okay. Come on up and introduce yourself, please. You'll have 3 minutes.
Hi, my name is Heather Yu. I'm not going to need 3 minutes. I'm here as a woman of color, a member of a small family-owned business, and also a concerned citizen. First, I'd like to thank the Commission and the City for working tirelessly on developing the new code, which for all intents and purposes has increased accessibility, affordability, and equity across the region. And for that, we recognize you. But I'd also like to draw attention to some areas where I feel that the code has fallen short or council direction has been misguided. For instance, by limiting the number of people who can move to Austin to 25% of regional growth forecasts is both irresponsible, inequitable, and environmentally disastrous. The truth is, for every single multifamily resident building that isn't built in Austin, an acre of sprawl tears through the hill country. For that reason, I hope that moving forward, the city and its partners and my fellow citizens will refocus our efforts to really start maximizing both all the issues I just listed, affordability, sustainability, and equity. And to do that, density is the answer. And I think we can start by doing away with parking requirements. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That's a great segue into Anderson. Oh, yeah. Commissioner Yanis Pulido, are you ready to present, or did you want to?
I'm ready.
Okay, perfect.
So I'll start with eliminating designations that increase impervious cover in or upstream of known flooding problem areas, either localized or impervious cover. I'm sorry, localized or in the floodplain. Let me pull up the actual one because I have it fresh. But basically the purpose of this is pretty self-explanatory. And I think we just need to, the intention is basically to have staff revisit some of these areas, primarily to look at if there's been an actual calculated impact analysis. I can just say for sure, in some of the most flood-prone areas of Southeast Austin, there are some areas that have not had a lot of proposed upzoning or where transition zones have been dialed down. But you go 2 or 3 streets immediately above them or north of them, and there is proposed upzoning and proposed increases in FAR and impervious cover. So the actual language is one second.
Do you mean the intent or the suggested language?
Suggested language. But that was pretty much, yeah. We could, if we're just going with intent.
Either or. I mean, the intent says prevent worsening of climate shocks and stressors for vulnerable communities, particularly those downstream from sites that are considered for increased impervious cover allowance. That's the intent. The language is eliminate increased IC limits in and upstream from problem areas, in quotes, as discerned from Watershed Protection Department's localized flooding data.
Thank you, Chair. Yes.
Okay.
That's it.
All right. Is there a second? Second by Commissioner Seeger. Staff?
Greg Dutton, Planning and Zoning. I'm not watershed staff. I think they will be here at some point, but we don't have them here currently. So I would just say that we don't oppose. We'll look into it.
Okay.
I feel confident with that answer.
Okay. Questions? Commissioner Thompson? Then Shea?
So when it says eliminate increased IC limits, is this IC per lot or sort of like overall limit? So if because we've seen that, I think we have just suggested that some of the R units actually be scaled back to 40% from 45. Mm-hmm. So if some of them go from 45 to 40 and some of them go from 45 to 50 and the overall impact on a watershed, for instance, is flat, is that the same as this, or are you talking about per lot it should be decreased?
So thank you for the question, and it's worded very awkwardly, so I'd like to propose just an adjustment to the language because it gets double negative-y when you're talking about limits. I'd rather say, do not increase impervious cover percentages in and upstream from problem areas.
Okay.
Let me get a second. Is it Seeger? Are you still good? Okay. Thompson, you get another chance.
I guess I just, without having anyone from Watershed, do we think that staff knows what is? I mean, because I know we have watersheds that are clearly defined, but do we have upstream from problem local areas clearly defined? Does anyone know?
So the intent here in the request is to look at flood problem areas, localized flood data that is available, and to make adjustments based on where runoff is currently draining and where on-site
right.
drainage would direct.
That's acceptable. Okay. And it's for the area, not for a particular lot.
Correct.
Okay.
Any other responses from the working group? If not, Commissioner Shea, did you raise your hand?
Yes, I did.
Yes, and then Commissioner Kenny.
Actually, there's no working group, right?
No working group. Oh, that's right. I don't want to keep doing that.
So this is a concern I think I had overall. I think it's something that we do need to study because as we see localized flooding, it's not specifically to like that area. It's really from whatever's upstream for it coming to whatever infrastructure is there. I think I have a concern about the statement being inequitable when you just say only for vulnerable communities. I think it's something that is citywide. That is a major concern on how all this stuff happens. So, is there a reason you only want to put this for vulnerable communities and not have it something for the whole city? Because, I see localized flooding in my neighborhood and everybody's neighborhoods.
Sure. Maybe we should start saying vulnerable with a capital V to reference the uprooted study. But in this case, I actually meant communities vulnerable to flooding.
Ah, okay. Okay, so just want to clarify, everybody's good. Okay, that's it.
Commissioner Kenny?
So I just want to clarify the substitute language that you offered. Is that for the suggested text or for the intent?
Most likely for intent, because this would actually require revisiting mapping. This would need to occur before a final map is adopted. There would need to be analysis on specific lots in areas where this is occurring.
So does that mean that it's fairly duplicative with the suggested text? So is the do not increase impervious cover percentages in and upstream from problem areas replacing the intent language and striking the suggested text?
I would prefer to submit as is.
Okay, so.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get straight on like what it is exactly we're submitting. So,
Both at this point.
okay, so don't use that substitute language. Use what's on the paper.
I'm suggesting to reword the suggested text to say, do not increase impervious cover percentages in and upstream from problem areas as discerned from watershed protection localized flooding data.
Okay, and then leave the intent text alone, just as filed. Okay.
Yes, please.
Okay, great. And I guess we already clarified it's on a watershed basis. Is that what we?
No, this is specific to localized flooding. I would be open to an amendment that includes watershed basis, but this is not captured by Atlas 14.
So you would look at the entire contributing area to a localized flooding area and say that impervious cover for everything that flows into that area shall not increase?
That's correct.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
One more question. Anyone? Okay. Commissioners speaking against? All right.
My concerns with this is I asked Watershed about this, almost this exact same question.
Are you speaking neutral or against?
I'm speaking against.
Okay.
Watershed still isn't here. I asked Watershed about this, almost this exact question several weeks ago, and they said that they didn't have the data to determine where the contributing areas were to localized flooding areas. So I don't like to speak against this, but from what Watershed, I asked, can we look at this? And they said that's not possible. We don't have that data. So it just doesn't seem actionable to me unless we have other information.
My understanding, there is a lot of data. There's not complete data on every source of localized flooding, but go ahead.
Anik, I don't have a mechanism to get you to respond. So, commissioners, if you have questions, ask the questions when it's your time to ask questions, not when it's time to speak against.
Sorry, Commissioner Seeger, did you?
I'm speaking for.
Go ahead.
I think that perhaps if we could change the wording a bit, we could mitigate some of the concerns about looking at this holistically. And the intent is to look at where the flooding is and perhaps then not increase the IC further down. But if we don't have all of the data today to make the strength and changes, perhaps we could say, consider within X amount of time, looking at and then ways to prevent downstream flooding through reduction in IC, et cetera, granted through this. Would that be acceptable, motion maker?
I would be open to an amendment that calls for some kind of impact analysis or another much more thorough and public process to identify where impervious cover is proposed in any area literally upstream. You can look at a topographical map pretty easily and see where some of the most vulnerable areas are with localized flooding. In order to make those determinations before increased impervious cover allowances are granted. And I wouldn't give any specific I wouldn't suggest any prescriptive timeline for that. But I would want there to be an impact analysis and a public review for it.
Okay, so that's very different than the motion that we have here. Is there someone making that amendment?
I will make the amendment, but I'm going to need to confer with Commissioner as to exactly what she would like in the amendment, so not as to destroy her intent. I think that we need data. I think we need the data soon. And I think that if we bring this to a public process, then we give credence to our residents that are currently flooding and very concerned. So I'm thinking about the language right now. And if you have any ideas of what you would like in this amendment, please speak up.
So I could take a stab at it. So I'll make an amendment to analyze local flooding prone areas and manage the impervious cover risks in the contributing areas. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And I've done subdivision cases before where staff has
Can we
made.
finish the motion first
Okay.
before you comment on it?
All right.
So this sounds like a substitute. Is this a
Is
substitute?
it substitute?
Can you read it one more time, please?
So analyze local flooding prone areas and manage IC in the contributing areas to mitigate additional flooding risks.
I see risks. But
Yeah.
And would this also be striking the suggested text?
Yeah, there's no suggested test on, yeah.
This is intent only.
Yeah.
All right, so everything else is struck. Motion by Commissioner Shea. Is there a second? Second by Commissioner Seeger. All right. No watershed staff, so questions? Commissioner Anderson?
First, Commissioner Shea, will you read it one more time?
I'll read it. Analyze, because
That's fine.
it's going to be different if, well,
That's
anyway.
fine, let's hear it.
Analyze local flooding prone areas and manage impervious cover in the contributing areas to mitigate additional flooding risks.
And is this also, I thought I heard something a minute ago about changing maps. Does this envision changing maps right now, or does this is a new process into itself, kind of just, we're going to get through this, not going to win? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Personally, I think that once we analyze this is going to answer a lot of questions. And if staff deems that maps have to tweak, then it needs to go. Then it needs to tweak. If it ends up impacting capacity, then we're going to have to get more capacity somewhere else. So it's not talking about that specifically, but this is really to start thinking in terms of not just the density we have, with the issues that we have, but also the environmental impact issues and concerns and safety that we have as well.
So I guess this could also lead to just a better stormwater management process.
It could.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Commissioner Thompson?
I think there was someone from, I think Ms. Bidet was going to talk about what data there might be in terms of localized flooding.
Anique Baudet, I didn't want to speak for Watershed on the data, but we did have conversations this morning based on not only feedback from this commission, but from the community on localized flooding. And we would like to consider how we might consider localized flooding in our, as we tee up our November 25th supplemental report. And so we're not opposed, as Mr. Dutton said, to considering localized flooding and considering what type of data we might have that could lend itself to us looking at a change in the supplemental that we would signal. So,
Any other questions?
Can I speak a little bit to why I kind of brought this up? So in some subdivision projects that I've had, basically just taking a lot and splitting it in two. We've gone through the process of, city has gotten us to go through the process of analyzing the flooding areas between one area to another, just in determining which way we're going to be flowing the water. And we were analyzing like 75 acres in this area. So we were doing analysis to see whether we're going to dump it this way or dump it that way, just on a residential subdivision case. So the capabilities are there. On the private side, we've had to do some sort of this. And I think this could be looked at and examined and scaled down to see where all this stuff goes, and even have some type of map. I mean, we deal with grading maps all the time. We see flow maps, and so why can't we add that to some of the oversight? So anyway, that's why I come from.
All right. If there's no questions, Commissioners speaking against? Commissioner Thompson?
I was supportive of the original motion, and I like the original motion because it seemed to me to have action, and it seemed to follow council's direction. Council's direction was let's don't increase impervious cover, and I think they tried to do that within watersheds. And this is kind of looking back, taking it at a sort of a smaller site and saying, well, maybe it's the same in the watershed, but it's going to cause a real problem right here in where my house is, and it's getting flooded every day or every time it rains. And so I thought it's kind of like making sure that council's direction is more specific and local with the data that we have. We don't have all the data, but we've got some, and so let's try and use that. Whereas I think this newer one seems a little vaguer, a little more, let's look at stuff and try to get some information and make things better, whereas the other one was very clear and, no increases in IC limits.
Speaking for?
I think the opposite in a lot of ways. I think the first one may have had just unintended consequences of maybe accidentally eliminating entire watersheds from more sustainable types of development. And I think of the type of development that's happening on the fringes of Austin and the unbelievable negative impacts we're seeing from sprawl and all being so auto-centric and taking away from some possible transit supportive density on some major places that we don't mean to do. So I like this. I think development's a process. It's not as though we're going to pass this new code and then suddenly do all these things. And so to look at this as we pass this new code and get more housing on the ground in the right places, I think staff's done a good job, and I think this is good direction moving forward.
All right. I'll quickly speak against. And that's a good segue that Commissioner Anderson said about staff having done a good job. I think we've heard from Matt several times and he's testified about why they're doing certain things on smaller lots. It's just not effective. I presented a couple of tables that looked at going from 45 to 60, and we're talking about 2%. If they're flooding right now, this is not going to make it any worse. I understand the intent. I understand why this amendment is being passed. I just, the infrastructure is undersized, and it's flooding today, and it's going to continue to flood. It's not changing this. Analyzing this is not going to change. The code today is causing that already. Commissioner speaking for or against? Okay, it's Commissioner Seeger.
I'm going to speak for both the original motion and the amended and the substitute, wherever we ended up. I think it was the substitute. The intent is to look at where is the flooding coming from, and is there anything that we can do within this LDC to help mitigate some of it? If it's happening today with our current densities, logical thought processes would indicate that perhaps we'll have more flooding in the future unless something significant does not happen to our infrastructure, i.e., larger infrastructure. If we put more into the current, we're going to have more flooding. This was intended to bring to the light that we need to do something, and we need data, combining both of them, and we need data to substantiate just where it's coming from. So I support both, but I'd like to see them melded into one where we get data and we use it.
Against or neutral? Commissioner Hempel?
I'm leaning towards being for this one, but on the neutral side, I just would like to have heard Watershed speak to this one.
Speaking for?
Is Watershed going to be here later? We could consider tabling
He's
it.
coming through the door now.
Ah, there you go. Well, make sure he doesn't get to sit down. He come right on up.
Come on right up to the podium, Matt. Do not pass go, do not collect 200. Okay, we had a motion and then we have a substitute. I'm just going to get you caught up. The first one said, do not increase impervious cover percentages in and upstream from, in quote, problem areas as discerned from Watershed Protection Department's localized flooding data. That was the first one. We're on a substitute right now that says, analyze local flooding-prone areas and manage impervious cover in the contributing areas to mitigate additional flooding risks.
Just want to point out that the amendment, as I have it noted, says manage the impervious cover risks, not necessarily manage the impervious cover.
Yes, he said risks, and then it changed in the next iteration.
So it's managed. So the impervious cover is the only tool that we're giving to manage.
So are there two questions? One is the tools to manage, and then the second one, or the original one, was impervious cover.
I was just getting you caught up. We needed your input on both of them, so
Okay.
I'll give you one chance to give your input on both.
Very good. Okay, so Matt Holland, Watershed Protection. So this has been an area of intense public interest in the last number of months, actually, as we've gone through this process. We have done some modeling on this. In general, we're not seeing a very high impact from these infill increases in impervious cover. We did do an initial screening of how much impervious cover was going up in each of these individual local flood problem areas, and most of them it's actually not going up at all, just they're not being remapped, or it's going down slightly in some cases. But there are a few where it does go up a little more than in those other areas. So we're basically committing to looking at that in a mapping exercise to dive in a little bit more to see if there are, because in general, again, we're not seeing major impacts from our local flood model. We did a detailed study of this in Del Curto, one of the more notorious flooding areas, and saw an extremely small increase when everything built out completely. However, these are all site-specific cases, and we would like to take a look at some of the areas around town, the small subset that look like they may have some other issues. So in general, we don't think the big driver is impervious cover, but we do want to take another look at it as we go down the trail here as we approach council, hearing concern from the various bodies that have weighed in on this.
So are you going to do that anyway without this motion? Is that what I'm understanding? Is you were going to do this anyway?
Well, your motion is one of the many that has actually prompted us to continue to look at this in a very detailed fashion, and so it's helpful to have the motion to look at it, to study it. That's something we also would like to take a look at it ourselves. Again, we don't think there's going to be a bombshell whole lot of change, but we think there could be some areas where we look at it and see where there's some site-specific circumstances where it would be warranted to pull back and potentially. Again, we're just starting that look.
Okay. Does that change anything?
I want to ask Matt a couple questions. I mean, first of all, I know we've been talking a lot about the IC, and you mentioned that.
I'm sorry. Can I say we've gone back to questions after we went on a motion?
I know.
I'm looking at the 6 p.m. time. I fear if there was an issue that required this in-depth of a conversation, we should have had that in the working groups. I'm surprised we didn't. This eats into time into anyone else's amendments who we might think are important. I'm just clarifying that I'm not saying that we stop this process, but I'm just saying I'm saddened to see that such an important issue, if it was something that required this much conversation, did not happen in the working groups.
Well, it did happen, though. I mean, it did happen. But this is an individual amendment. Every commissioner has the right to do that. So I'm going to allow 2 more questions. We're going to move on. All right, 2 questions, and we're going to take a vote.
Okay, so to continue the question, so what you mentioned was you don't see IC as just the single most driver. What are the other drivers to that? So if we wanted to add it to the motion, we could, rather than just limit to IC. Number 2 is once you get the data, analyze it, is that going to affect how you map things? And is that going to affect how you deal with site plan light? I mean, I want to understand that you get this and what happens down the road. What's your vision on this?
Okay, great question. So we are just beginning this, so we don't have any results yet, but we would want to look at specific areas to see if there's something that pops out when we look at the actual details, topography, that sort of thing. So the other factors that you're referring to, that I was referring to, are probably things you can't actually change. I mean, you're just going to have some structures too close to a flow path. Somebody's built in the drainage easement. Somebody's too close. And so there's a lot of things that are just going on to drive local flooding, blocked pipes, all kinds of things that don't have anything to do with the code or new development. And so a lot of the drivers of local flooding have to do with just ancient infrastructure that's undersized, or that the built environment is just built in such a way that it's creating some unfortunate problems. The code comes in when we talk about the impervious cover, and potentially you have this other amendment that talks about other measures that could be done. Those things are things like rain tanks or other kind of micro ponds and things like that that could be used. All of those have promises and pitfalls because they are, anytime you put infrastructure in the ground, you need to make sure that it's there and it's operational and so forth over time. And so we have looked at this in some detail. It's a difficult situation. The smaller and more micro you go, the more difficult it is to actually make sure that this stuff is in place. That doesn't mean it might not be a good idea, but it's something that we would take a much harder look at.
Can you start touching upon how that would affect how you map?
Yes, thank you for reminding me of that. Okay, so in the Atlas 500 floodplain, we said no transition zones in the 500-year floodplain. We were not nearly. We did not think that was warranted in the local flood problem areas, but there could be some areas where we would recommend. I have to look at this first, of course, or our team, our engineers, but there could be some areas where we want to pull back a little bit on the intensity of those upzonings and those.
So you'll make a recommendation once you kind of do this exercise, and then we might be pulling back, not just in the 500, which is new 100, you're going to have these recommended other ones, and that'll be coming.
Right.
So whether we do this amendment or not, this is happening. Am I correct?
Yes, we're committing to doing this work.
Okay,
yes.
Thanks.
One last question, anyone? Only because Matt wasn't here, I want to allow that opportunity.
Quick question for Matt. So right now the motion is to analyze local flood-prone areas and manage IC to mitigate risks. Is that happening already? Like, how does that work? Like, what's the process right now when you get a lot of 311 calls from an area about flooding and it's happening time and time again? Like, what's the process right now to get in front of that?
The equivalent process in the areas that would have the transition zones is that single-family homes are being built, and a lot of those are maxing out, and they're causing probably the same, really similar problems that these other new ones would cause, if there are problems. Usually, frankly, there's not a problem. But there are cases where you have somebody builds and they flood their neighbor or what have you. And so the recourse traditionally has been to go through the municipal court system or mediate or that sort of thing. As we've mentioned to you guys before, we've come out with this new plumbing code provision that allows the city to assist in trying to help resolve those problems.
Thank you, Matt. All right, we've got one more commissioner speaking for, and then we're going to take a vote. All right, let's take a vote. This is for the substitute motion. We're not going to go back to the original motion. This is it on this amendment. Yes, but the substitute is in replacement of the original. So we take a motion on this, and then we move on to the next commissioner. Any questions on that?
I guess I'm just forgetting the process difference. I know we're voting on amendments and not substitutes, but was that substitute that's it? That's just decided?
I mean, yeah, if the substitute fails, then we go back to the original.
No, we don't go back to the original.
You can't make a substitute that's going to be a poison pill is going to fail, and then the original never gets voted on?
Yeah, and where's the decision on switching from the original to the substitute?
If it passes, we
don't need a second vote. We just move on. If it fails, then we go back to the original.
Is that accurate, Andrew?
If it fails, we go back to the original. Otherwise, you can poison pill.
Okay, so we vote on the substitute. If the substitute fails, it goes back to the original.
Okay, that's not my understanding, but I'm going to ask for Andrew just for a second.
Yeah.
Chair Commission Liaison Andrew Vera, if you have a substitute motion, you would act on that substitute motion. If it fails, you go back to the original amendment.
Okay, thank you. I stand corrected. Let's take a vote. All those in favor, raise your hand. All those against?
The count changed.
I'm sorry?
The count changed if you turn your head.
Okay. Count changed when I turned my head. All right.
Sorry.
Substitute motion, commissioners that are for, please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Against? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Abstaining? Okay. So that fails 5-5-1. Back to the original motion. I had one person speaking for and one speaking against. Does anyone still want to speak against or for or neutral?
I'll speak for. So I appreciated the conversation, and this is really critical because we had just as recently as last night chipping away at removing the greenfield stuff that people have been working on for a really long time. So this is important nuances. I'm supportive of both the substitute motion and the original motion. I would love to turn it all over to council to consider. Just remember, the final decision is in the council's hand, but I think if we don't put a strong amendment forward to acknowledge the very real risk, not just in 500-year events, not just in 100-year events. The last 2 rains, people have flooded. And we have to be looking at the risks associated with impervious cover and the risks associated with some of the mitigation that's been proposed for impervious cover, including on-site detention, which in some cases can make things more dangerous for people downstream. So we're asking for them to look at this. We're asking for them not to increase impervious cover upstream and in the problem areas as discerned from the localized flooding that they do have, and council can adjust this with staff's recommendations.
Speaking against? Commissioner Kinney?
Chair, I'm sorry, can I quickly ask someone to restate? So we're doing text as was restated and the intent? Is that correct?
Yeah, let me do that. Thank you. So the intent is the same. Prevent worsening of climate shocks and stresses for vulnerable communities. Vulnerable is to flooding. Vulnerable to flooding communities, particularly those downstream from sites that are considered for increased impervious cover allowance. That's the intent. The suggested language is do not increase impervious cover percentages in and upstream from problem areas, in quote, as discerned from Watershed Protection Department's localized flooding data. Both of those are part of the amendment. Commissioner Kinney, did you get a chance to speak against, or did you get cut off?
I got cut off.
Okay, go ahead.
So I just want to point out that the impervious cover changes, I don't know if you all still have this chart I made, but the interesting thing about it, and what I appreciated that staff did, is that for the commercial and very intense zoning, the impervious cover limits actually decrease in several zones. In MU3, MU4, MU5, they all decrease by 10 percentage points or 5 percentage points. Where they go up is in for residential. So this would, by limiting the impervious cover increases that are balanced in the code and make them all neutral or decreases in this area, it's quite literally costing housing units. And I think that we've seen a lot of presentation, and there's a tremendous amount of upgrade and mitigation of flooding risk in the new code. So I think that this lacks that nuance and just causes housing units. So I'm opposed.
One more for and one more against. Commissioner Thompson?
As I said, I think, staff's direction is don't, sort of try not to increase impervious cover. I think it's specifically, if my house is flooding now, don't make it worse. And even if it's, only 2% worse or only 5% worse, that's still worse, and we shouldn't be making it worse. They shouldn't be paying the price of this increase. And I think there's enough place, as Matt Holland said, there's a lot of places that it's not a problem. So let's just make sure that we are balancing that and putting it where it's not a problem and not where it is.
Last commissioner speaking against. Neutral, go ahead.
So I'm going to speak neutral to this. I mean, I totally agree with the intent. The concern I have is when you say too prescriptive, say don't increase IC limits. I mean, when development happens and let's say development actually comes in, they actually do water quality and water management, you might increase the IC, but you actually have an engineered solution to actually make it better.
So I think it's too limiting to just say, don't increase IC. I think the whole idea is to manage it better. So I think I'm going to end up being neutral on this one.
Okay. All right, let's take a vote. This is the main amendment, number 1 from Yanis Pulido. All those in favor, raise your hand. All those against? Abstaining? All right, that motion fails 4-5-2. The time is 5:54. Rather than get into another one, Commissioner Anderson, we'll just ask you to be patient. We'll take a break for 10 minutes and come back at 6:05, and then we'll start with the agenda. Reading of the agenda. All right?
Chair, Commission Liaison Andrew Vera, we're going to take up the agenda at 6:30.
We were. I was going to change that. Is that okay? Or
Sure.
yeah. We're going to take it up at 6:05.
Chair, actually, applicants in the neighborhood were informed.
We're told 6:30? Okay.
Correct.
All right, change of plans, folks. We're going to keep going. Commissioner Anderson.
Okay, so it didn't make it into the spreadsheet, but Andrew just sent it around to everybody. Open to suggestions for better language. I'll read out intent, and you guys can help me land there. So simplify F25 compatibility standards to align with the new code. The intent is we know how bad and weird it gets when compatibility is triggered by use. So let it be zoning alone that triggers it. I'm thinking SF4 and more restrictive. Also, like it was in draft 1, F25 compatibility triggering properties cannot cross a 60-foot road. So if you have F25 on one side and non-F25 on the other side, it's not hit by F25, especially by the old way of compatibility. Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Is there a second? Second by Commissioner Seeger. Staff, could you all comment on if there's a mechanism to do that with this revision?
So I think definitely in favor of simplification when we can. Based on what I read, I think that the amendment would actually be amending the current code. Is that, I mean, compatibility in the current code is based on use and zoning.
Right.
And so I'm not sure that it's,
How
within-
and when you do it is up to you.
Okay, so it is about the Title 25 current code, not the new code. Okay.
That's correct. Is there anything we can do with this draft to?
Well, so in the new draft code, I think it speaks to the second part of your amendment, Commissioner Anderson, that the F25 zones will trigger the new compatibility standards onto the new zoning districts, so they won't be impacted in the old sense of compatibility with use or zone. It'll just be zone. But F25 properties will trigger on each other. They will live in the old world with use or zone triggering compatibility. I actually can't think of a way that it would be simplified because in the new draft code, if you're F25, you live in that old world. If you're a new zone, you live in the new world where you have new compatibility standards.
Okay.
So there's actually not any real crossover with old compatibility being imposed on the new zones.
I think that's helpful. Commissioner Anderson, is this still, you want to keep going? All right.
Sure.
Questions?
I have an amendment.
Okay.
And you can give me a nod, Commissioner Anderson, or second if you like. New text to say amend F25 compatibility to use the new code triggers and zone distances step backs in the most equivalent new code zones.
Okay, one more time.
So amend F25 compatibility to use the let's call it the draft codes triggers. So whatever the adjacency or distance or definitely zone and not use, and use zone distances and step backs in the most equivalent draft code zones. So if SF or if R2 says, or that's not a good example. If RM5, which is equivalent to MF6, has this height at 50 feet and this height at 100 feet. An MF6 F25 property would use that same X height at Y distance calculation. So essentially what this is saying is to the most equivalent degree possible, use the new compatibility calculations for F25.
Second. Commissioner Anderson. So Greg, it sounds like nothing's changed. This is still in the old world that we're asking you to amend. Is that correct?
That's right.
So same comments from you, I would suspect?
Yeah, it just sounds to me like the comment from Commissioner Kenny would make it different in the new draft that F25 properties would have a more reduced compatibility standard compared to today's code, compared to Title 25 compatibility. Okay.
And then the triggering issue, I think, is also pretty key. Yeah. Okay.
But to impact the compatibility within F25 to each other, that would still need something in the old world.
That would still, those properties would still
need
be.
a code amendment.
Right, exactly.
Is that your understanding? Okay. All right. Questions? Commissioner Shaw?
So I don't know if there's any merit to this, but if I'm next, I do have a compatibility related to the new code. I don't think it'll really affect what's going here, but I think you're asking staff to figure out kind of equivalency as what matches up. But there are some things that I don't understand, and I'm going to try to get staff to discuss with us on why they set different step backs, 50 foot, 100 foot. I don't quite understand why, because some of the buildings are the same height. So, but I don't think these two really need to be taken together. I think they could be separate.
Yes, if you make recommendations of senior amendments that change the draft code, because the instruction here is just use whatever the equivalent is, those changes would carry forward into this.
All right, then I think we can proceed. Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? All right, commissioners speaking against. Again, the motion is an amendment. Is this an amendment? Is that correct, or is it substitute?
Substitute.
Okay.
Okay.
We'll work it out. Let's do it as an amendment. We'll work it out. Award F25 compatibility to use draft codes triggers and use zone distances and step backs in the most equivalent draft code zones. All right. Speaking against. Speaking for. Speaking neutral. Let's take a vote. All those in favor, raise your hand. Any opposed? Abstaining? All right, that passes 9-2. Let's take a vote right away on the other one because it sounded a lot like a substitute. Is there any funny overlap that's happening if we take the other one as well?
No, I mean, it was really.
Okay.
So.
All right. All right, let's take a vote. All those in favor, raise your hand. Any opposed? Abstaining? All right, that passes 9-2 as well. Commissioner Shaw?
Okay, if I speak slowly, let's see, it's number 1 revised on under Todd Shaw amendments. Are we okay? You want a point of order?
You said 9-2.
9-2. 10-2. Thank you, Commissioner Anderson.
So if I could have a couple of exhibits, we might go between them. They're in the list there, 1B, Shaw Exhibit 1B, Shaw Exhibit 7, those two. So I guess I'll read the amendment. Per council direction and consistent with other zones that can reach 60 foot or more in height, compatibility height step back distance from the triggering property for MU3, MU4, MU5A, MU5B, MS2A, MS2B zones should reach base standard height at a distance greater than 100 foot from the lot line of the triggering property. And so we can, I don't know if we can enlarge that at all to look. So yeah, well, so if you kind of look at the evolution of compatibility, going from the current code, and then you look at code next, kind of where it left off on draft 3, and keep going down. And then there was some work between the ZAP last time. There was a working group proposal. Then we had PC recommendation, which through a lot of deliberation, we decided compatibility at 100 feet. Buildings should be able to go to full height. And then now what we have, this is, forgive my attempt at trying to, I think we asked staff to do this, but you'll have to put up with my rendering here. So now at 50 feet, we allow certain zones to go to full height that are shown there in the blue and the red. Some up to like 90 feet, they can hit full height at 90. That's with the density bonus. And then all the other zones are at 100-foot distance, consistent with what we did last time, and code next draft 3. So if we go to, we can go to the next exhibit. It kind of just, what you see here is a table just showing all of the step back distances. And in yellow, you can just see those are the ones that are kind of the outliers that at 50 feet can go to full height. And so what I'm proposing is just if we read council, I think was pretty, they wanted the transition areas to really serve as that buffer to remove compatibility. But then they used this language to discuss what they wanted to happen when, kind of under today's conditions, we have commercial and residential kind of adjacent to each other. And I'll just read it. Council direction, draft 3's no build and vegetative buffers between residential and commercial uses, as well as other compatibility triggers and standards for properties adjacent to a residential house scale zone. So they wanted to maintain those buffers and setbacks and stepbacks. That's the way I interpret this. And we can get staff to back me up on that. But when I read this, it means, yeah, transition areas, we all agree, compatibility is off the table. But council wanted to maintain the draft 3, and that to me means that 100-foot step back and also the setbacks, which is another amendment I have for later, they should be maintained. So that's what I'm proposing here.
Is there a second? Second by Commissioner Seeger. Staff?
So originally in this draft, what we were thinking is that for areas that don't have transition zones behind them that would kind of obviate the compatibility, that there would be a 50-foot depth instead of 100 for those zones that were more likely to be on corridors where you would still want them to achieve their height. But we actually we've been talking about it and we looked into it, and we think in the interest of making the compatibility more uniform at 100 feet, that's what it was in draft 3, and because of the way it's mapped now with transition zones that obviate the need for compatibility, and because of the way the other zones are mapped, I think we would be okay with returning it to one standard across the board as suggested.
Okay. Thank you, Greg. We might need you for some more questions. Commissioners? Commissioner Shaw, then Shea.
So I don't know if you have an answer to this, but I think what some folks might be wondering is, I know compatibility kind of enters into the modeling. So do you have any kind of feel for how this might impact the housing numbers? Because I think that's what folks are going to want to know.
I couldn't give you a number right now, but because of the way it's mapped, I don't think the change from 50 to 100 will actually have a large impact. It wouldn't result in a large decrease, for instance, in capacity, just because of the way it's mapped.
Commissioner Shea? Did I see a hand on this side? No?
Quick question.
Go ahead.
Mr. Dutton, does this make compatibility more restrictive or less restrictive?
It makes it more restrictive.
And how would that play out?
Well, it would just mean that the zones that were shown that have a 50-foot, where height can be achieved, the max height at 50 feet, it would then be pushed back to 100.
Can you describe those zones where the 50 feet is in the current draft?
Yeah, so those zones are the more intense MU and MS zones. But again, because of where they're mapped, a lot of them, and I think most of them, have transition behind them, so they don't actually have compatibility triggered on them because of the zone that's adjacent to them.
Greg, with that answer, would they continue to have to be mapped there? I mean, it would seem like if it's not uniform, if it's not always at 100 feet, then it would seem like if it were either accidentally or intentionally mapped somewhere without a transition zone behind them, that you wouldn't achieve that same result that you're looking for.
Right. So if you, for instance, if you were to change the transition zones so that they were suddenly no longer behind those corridors, then you would have a significant impact, I think, on the compatibility, because you'd be changing from 50 to 100, where full height can be achieved, throughout a large area, a much larger area. So yes, it does depend where it's mapped and how it's zoned.
Thank you. One more question, Commissioner Azar.
So I have a set of questions. I guess my first question is, what I'm hearing is that y'all are already considering the 100-foot. In some ways, what we're saying within this amendment is something that staff is already considering, going from the 50 to 100.
Yeah, yes, we had been discussing it ourselves and talking about the possibility of changing it.
Okay, and then my second question was, so I think building on what Chair Kazi was just saying, so I hear what you're saying, right? So if you have a transition zone, it wouldn't trigger it, so you're fine. But for things like TODs, where then we have not built transition zones around them, and that's something that I know we have talked about a lot, this would then really bring that into consideration, that our TODs need to have transition zones around them. Otherwise, they're having compatibility triggered on them because they don't have transition zones around them, and now we're talking about 100 feet compatibility trigger.
Yes, and so to that, I would say that the TODs themselves, instead of using the adjacent zoning to try to release compatibility, really it'd be more beneficial to look at the TODs as a whole and whether compatibility should apply to TODs at all. It's just a question that needs to be evaluated as part of a TOD reevaluation.
And is that something that staff is considering, thinking of?
So yes, so not as a part of this process, but as a part of a follow-up to this, we would like to reevaluate all of the TODs and all of the TOD regulations.
And I guess this kind of goes to that. You all wouldn't have the capacity numbers, but I'm trying to think what impact this might have on the affordable housing numbers, just because those are the ones that are captured in the bonus. And if you think the height, it's the bonus that would go down first.
Yeah, and again, I don't have a number, but following up on my answer to Commissioner Shaw, I think it wouldn't be a large impact, but we can certainly try to look at it and see how many properties, for instance, would be impacted by it, if that would be of interest. But
I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, that was 4 questions. Commissioners speaking against?
For an amendment?
Go ahead.
Append the statement onto the end of the intent that provided that transition zones are mapped away from Imagine Austin centers and TODs.
Say that one more time.
Provided that transition zones are mapped away from TODs and Imagine Austin centers. So if this is truly not intended to impact compatibility on TODs and IA centers, then let's make sure that we have a transition zone mapped. And you know what, I'll even do one better on you. I'll say provided that transition zones are mapped for TODs and IA centers such that this compatibility change does not impact within TODs or IA centers.
Is there a second?
I think this is just the catching for when it doesn't happen, so I think that's fine. I mean, do we want to do that or think about TODs just having their own, not being included in this?
We're about to decide whether.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll second.
Okay. Staff shouldn't have a response to that. Questions?
Speak to.
Go ahead.
What I just want to avoid is this amendment being taken up, but that our other recommendation not be taken up, and have the aggregate impact being actually reimposing further compatibility on TODs and IA centers. So that's why I want to expressly link the two.
So that's the intent of what you're saying. Okay.
Any questions? Commissioner Azar?
Commissioner Kenny or staff, can y'all speak to what about the impact on North Burnett Gateway?
And I do want to remind the commission of our amendment that our recommendation that overrides all other ones, that further transition zones will not be mapped in the gentrifying areas that we chose to protect.
The question was North Burnett Gateway.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would be the same answer as with the TOD.
And I guess what I was trying to raise was that actually we've now mentioned TODs and with IA centers, but North Burnett Gateway, I guess it falls within an IA center, so it would also be protected from compatibility then.
Yes, I mean if that's part of the motion, yes.
Other questions? Speaking against? Speaking for? Let's take a vote on the amendment. This is just adding language to the end of the intent, provided that transition zones are mapped for IA centers. From?
So out external
Yeah.
to them.
From IA centers and TODs such that this compatibility does not impact within TODs and IA centers. Okay, not redundant. Okay. Let's take a vote. All those in favor, raise your hand. Any opposed? Any abstaining? Okay, that passes 11-0-1. Back to the main motion. We've had all the questions. Commissioner speaking against? Speaking for? Commissioner Thompson?
I think, compatibility is a tool for sort of an emergency lever when zoning has broken. I mean, if things are properly zoned, we do have these transition areas. We're stepping down, and compatibility is just kind of a safety measure to say, oh, if someone, got spot zoning, or if for some reason I can't step down, do I still have some protection from sort of incompatible development? And so I think this is a great amendment.
Speaking against, or neutral, or for? Let's take a vote. All those in favor, raise your hand. Any opposed? Any abstaining? Okay, that motion passes. 12-0.
The amendment got me.
It's 6:17. We could take a 13-minute break and then reconvene. Keep going? No stops? Is there any opposition to keep going and then just get right into 6:30?
Just finish with the round.
Okay. All right. Commissioner Hempel.
I'm clear. So, my amendment number 1 got covered yesterday, which is great. I'll go with amendment number 2, which has to do with the tree removal variance in 23-4C 2040. I work with this code a lot in the current code, and in speaking with some of the folks who are very familiar with it. This one hopefully goes pretty quickly. I would like to have staff explore clarifying the reasonable use verbiage. when in the language about the code and removing a tree. My understanding is that this citation has been in the code since '83 and has never really clearly been defined, and so the intent is to help clarify that for everybody who's going to be using the code. And so that's the intent. I've got some suggested language that might help, but doesn't necessarily have to be passed as part of the amendment. That being, it could apply to each section within the tree code, not just protected trees. Perhaps there's a sliding scale dependent upon property type or credit for green infrastructure that directly benefits the general public. So just better putting some language and clarification around the term reasonable use as related to removing trees.
Okay, is there a second? Second by Commissioner Azar. Staff?
Brent Lloyd with the LDC leadership team. I'm trying to find, I apologize, just give me 1 second. I'm trying to find the language. So I believe that we actually did propose a change to the definition of reasonable use, and I may have misheard you, but it sounded like you were saying the current language had been in there since '83 or something, and we actually did propose an update, and this appears both in the tree provisions as well as in the water quality environmental provisions, and the language is a use for a specific parcel of land that is reasonable use means a use for a specific parcel of land that is reasonable based on the specific site circumstances, including but not limited to parcel size, zoning, trees, environmental features, and other applicable regulations. A reasonable use must be a permitted use, but need not be the economically highest and best use of a parcel, and must be among the least impactful potential uses of the property. So I think that definition, revised definition, was worked out with several people from the team, including Watershed and the arborist, and it's really just intended to provide a little bit better of a flavor for the Land Use Commission to kind of consider cases, and it's meant to emphasize that reasonable use is not always going to be the most profitable use of the land, that it has to not be the most environmentally impactful, and that it's really based on the site circumstances. And this definition is not applied to BOA. BOA has their own standards derived from case law. So this is really confined to trees and environmental regulations. And staff believes that it provides more clarity as to what the commission should be looking at, while also allowing you all to exercise discretion and make decisions that you consider appropriate based on circumstances.
So as someone who may be using the code to understand that, would they have to go and talk to staff directly to understand reasonable use, or is there any better bookends we can put on that in the code?
Well, if it were that clear, then a commission-approved variance wouldn't be necessary, and we could just write it into code as an administrative requirement. I mean, it's a discretionary standard, and staff in these cases will make recommendations, so the applicant will know what staff's recommendation is. But it really is something that the best that we're able to do is really provide reference points and factors that are to be considered, but it ultimately is the commission's sovereign decision to make the judgment call. And I think that it's really hard to come up with a one-size-fits-all definition. And we feel, the staff that worked on this do feel, that this is an improvement over the current language, which I think there may not even be there's barely any definition of it right now at all. So we feel that this moves the ball forward. But it's a difficult issue.
I'd like to pull this amendment.
Okay. Huh? I don't know. So we're going to come back to you or offer another amendment? Okay, all right. Okay, it's 6:23. Do we need a quick break or not? There's not a dinner break, so we're just going to keep going until we get done.
Let's get through the consent.
That's going to be at 6:30. Do we need a break until then?
No, let's go.
Keep going, okay. All right, we're going to start with Azar. Keep going.
So I have a combined set that I'm going to go on, essentially what are here as my number 3 and number 4. So these are two intents. I'm going to read them together. Revise, align, and strengthen post-construction requirements, reporting, compliance, monitoring, and enforcement mechanisms and procedures, and penalties for all affordable housing bonus programs, Affordability Unlocked, and the Smart Housing Program. And consider requiring a monitoring and compliance fee from all participants of the affordable housing bonus programs. That's my motion, and I can speak to it quickly. Essentially, yes.
Did you speak to both of them? Or are you going both of them together?
Yes. Essentially, it's one intent.
And did you already read both of them?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So second by Seeger, okay?
Seeger. So essentially, the first one is we have a number of different requirements within different sections of the affordability section. Affordability Unlocked has post-construction requirements and penalties. Some of the other ones have reporting, enforcement mechanisms, and procedures. I'm essentially just saying let's revise them, align them, strengthen them wherever possible, and come up with something stronger for all of our affordable housing programs. So this essentially gets to monitoring and compliance and penalties in case somebody is not following through on some of those requirements. And the second piece was simply saying that we consider a monitoring and compliance fee from all participants of the affordable housing bonus program. So note that is only for the bonus programs. That is not for smart housing or for affordability unlocked, because we expect those to be layered with other government subsidies, or we expect them to be coming from mission-based affordable housing providers. So that would just be for the affordable housing bonus program to help with some of this work.
Okay, so that's Azar 3 and 4. Staff? Any thoughts? Okay. Questions? We'll wait for staff to decide. Are there any questions?
I was hoping staff would be here. Is Erica?
I think I heard she was going between meetings. There's
Okay.
2 commission meetings going on.
You're trying to wing it?
We would like Erica Leak to help address this question. She stepped out. I think she will be back very shortly.
Okay. All right. Do we want to pause this and then go with Commissioner Howard? We'll come back to you when Erica comes back.
I also have an affordability amendment. I'm borrowing Azar's because I didn't submit mine.
Do we need to wait for Ms. Leak for that as well?
I'm wondering if we do. It's about transition zones. Maybe not.
Actually, yeah, go for it.
Is this number 5?
So it's number 2 under Azar.
Okay.
And I'm changing the wording just a little. Talking about compatibility and transition zone depth. So I'm going to actually change the wording a little bit. And gentrifying areas, I'm going to say maybe regardless of transition depth as opposed to saying 0 lots. Compatibility should be waived on the corridor lot if the development is participating in an affordable housing bonus program, Affordability Unlocked, or the Smart Housing Program.
I'll second that.
Okay. Howard Azar. Staff.
Erica Leak, Neighborhood Housing. I understand the question was about the monitoring fee and monitoring of affordable units in general.
We're going
Was
to
there
come
s-
back to that one. We moved to a different one. We'll come back to that one.
Okay.
In a second. Do we need? Did you need Ms. Leak to respond to this one as well?
Okay.
Okay. All right, commissioners. Are there questions about Azar number 2?
Can you just clarify, so are you eliminating, it just goes, in gentrifying area, compatibility should be waived on corridor lots? Is that right? So we're taking out, okay.
Yes.
Any other questions?
I'm still confused. Are we talking about transition areas?
It's talking about compatibility.
Yes. So let me.
Because I thought there was no compatibility in transition areas, so I'm kind of missing the point here, I think.
So it's saying in gentrifying areas, if the transition zone is reduced to 0 lots, because there's been some talk about that. If the transition zone goes away, compatibility should be waived on the corridor lot.
Right.
If the development is participating in some sort of affordable program.
Okay.
And I think I've seen examples of that.
So it would just be whatever setback is per that zone. Just goes
Yes.
back to. Okay.
Does
So
staff have a comment on that?
Just that from a zoning point of view, we would concur with that.
Okay, great, thank you. Any other questions? Well, you can ask a question or answer a question.
If I can answer, Commissioner, but Commissioner Seeker, go ahead.
I was going to ask the question of Commissioner Azar, what do you mean by this?
So I think essentially with this one, thank you. I think there's some conversation on how do we manage our transition zones, whether they were going to go shallower or not. So I think the concern here is if we go to 0 transition zone depth in the gentrifying areas, suddenly we'll trigger compatibility onto the corridor lot. And so the concern here is if we end up doing that, then it cuts back on our affordability bonus on those corridors. So this is saying, and I think Commissioner Howard changed the language rightfully, so regardless of transition zone depth, we're not saying what that is or is not. Whatever that depth is, let's just ensure that we do not have compatibility triggered onto the corridor lots so we maintain those bonuses. And I guess the other caveat here is that if you notice my notes, what I said was we already voted to say that we would not have a bonus on naturally occurring affordable housing. So this would only be on non-naturally occurring affordable housing. Does that clarify the question? Or, no?
Could I just ask something? So the motion makers, I guess, do you have any concerns that we're treating this part of town a little differently? Because I'm worried that they're going to have a different compatibility standard and the housing in that area of town is going to have a different setback. And do you think that'll be perceived in a way that may be a negative instead of a positive? Because, in the high opportunity areas, they're going to have nice setbacks and stepbacks and not so in the vulnerable areas. So I'm just concerned how that might be perceived. Do you have any concern about that?
I'd say no. I mean, I think you're talking about going along the corridor. I don't think that's readily apparent what you're talking about. I mean, in light of the idea of allowing more, creating more affordable options or more affordability, I don't see that as being the critical factor there.
And I think quickly just to that, I feel like that is why we particularly mentioned anyone who's participating in the bonus program. So it wouldn't be for, if you're just doing base, then you would still get compatibility triggered. It is only if you're providing income restricted units and you're getting to that ability of using the bonus, only then would compatibility be waived. And and we don't know what this would look like. If staff keeps it to what it is today, then this amendment doesn't even matter. But it's just to give that flexibility of allowing that movement within our depth of the transition zone. So I'll be honest, this is also my way of saying that we could go shallower on our transition zones in some of the really susceptible areas. If we're concerned about the impact on corridor, this takes away that concern. So it allows us to make a more nuanced decision about our transition zones.
Chair, substitute motion.
Go ahead.
Compatibility should be waived on all corridors.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Staff?
That's basically what we're saying, right? I guess it depends on what kind of corridor.
Just for simplification.
Can you clarify the question or repeat the question?
Sir, it's a substitute motion, and it's, compatibility shall be waived on all corridors.
Is it through the bonus or just altogether?
So just a point of order here. If we already passed the 100, the compatibility standard with the 100-foot setback, this is then modifying that we already agreed to, I believe, because it's saying there is no compatibility on a corridor, right? So there is no step back or setback.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
So we voted on 100-foot step back is where you go to full height. So I think this is taking it on corridors, saying that there is no compatibility standard, that they're waived.
This is for the first lot.
Yes.
Sure. I would dispute that. We received advice from staff that they did not believe that this would impact compatibility on the corridors because they believe
it will. There are zones. There are zones that are right
the
behind.
staff comment, as a statement of fact, was that they did not believe that this would have that your amendment would have impacts on kind of compatibility on corridors due to the way the transition zones were mapped. That's the advice that we received at the time that we voted on that amendment.
Yeah, but I'm thinking of it not from a housing standpoint, but from the compatibility.
I
We
would
already passed the 100
contend
foot.
that Commissioner Czar's amendment would be an exception to the broad amendment that we passed.
But now we're not talking about Azar, we're talking about Anderson. Anderson's compatibility waived on all corridors. I would argue that that is in conflict with the one that we just passed. I'm not going to make that decision, though. I'm just going to put it up to the commissioners. Is there someone that wants to make a motion to decide whether we take this up or not?
So I put it second, but I'm going to pull back on my second.
Okay, is there another second? Commissioner Howard, second. So before we act on that one, I need another motion to say whether we take this up. If there's not a motion, I'm just going to pull it down because it's in conflict with the one we just passed.
The one we just passed wasn't supposed to hit corridors anyway, as Commissioner Kenny Connor just pointed out.
It's for corridors. It's exactly for corridors and TPN.
But with his addition, it wasn't supposed to hit corridors, centers.
Whose addition?
The addition, the amendment
Is that
to
what you
your
meant?
motion.
I think there's a conflict here.
No, it wasn't about corridors. It was just centers and TODs.
Commissioners, I can't lose control. Just make a motion. If we want to discuss it, we can discuss it through a motion.
You have a motion on the table in a second.
A very deep subject that we need to talk about and we need to clarify because we are confused.
Thank you. Is there a second to that motion? Second by Commissioner Shea. Are there questions? Let's take a vote. The motion is to start the public hearing. All right.
Start the public hearing.
All those in favor, raise your hand. Any opposed? All right, that motion carries 11-1.